So what's your attitude about change? Well, what's your appraisal of it? Asking that, obviously, this earthly life that we experience inherently entails some changes. We don't have a choice in whether or not we're going to face them or not. Harold, we're going to get older. That's a change that we experience, and again, whatever our attitude might be toward it, it's something that we can't escape. But even those inherent changes that are inevitable and inescapable, likely they are met with differing attitudes by different people. There are some people who seem to welcome change. They find it exciting. They find it challenging. I don't know, maybe they would think life is boring if it didn't have those built-in changes. Then again, others are not so much welcoming those changes. They might prefer things that are rather predictable and structured and routine. Because I know all of us recognize change usually comes with a degree of uncertainty. And that uncertainty can kind of disrupt our sense of security that we derive from what is familiar to us. So, as I think about those two classes of people, I probably find myself maybe leaning one way more so than the other, but I'm just asking you, as you think about just the concept of change, how do you meet it? What's your attitude toward it? Now, some change, we do have a choice in making. Some changes we can invite into our lives. And once again, probably there are differing attitudes with regards to how we meet those changes. Tracy, I know something that was out of your control, but you get a new supervisor. All right, well, that's out of your control, but what about if you have a choice of taking a new job, changing your job? Or what about maybe a decision as to whether or not you ought to change where you live? Within a community, maybe within the United States or across the world? Or what if you're contemplating a change as it relates to your family? We've had a couple of weddings recently, so that's introducing change into our lives. And again, how do we meet that? How do we face that? What is our attitude toward that? Well, as we think about changes that we have some decision in making or choice in deciding on whether or not we're going to make them, our attitude toward those changes might require some additional qualifying questions as to those changes before we would offer an answer. We might want to know what type of change it's going to be. We might further want to know to what degree or level is this change going to affect me? I mean, how comprehensive is it going to be? We might want to know, how is this change going to personally impact my life? And again, what is that impact going to bring? How long is it going to last? Are those impacts all favorable? Are there some that are unfavorable? Friends, I offer all of these questions and considerations basically just to bring to the forefront of our minds this concept of change. Because in my opinion, it is an interesting dynamic of life. It can be very powerful. And hopefully that well segues into our being reminded of our current series, because we are talking about a changed life. Now, we are particularly focusing our attention upon one person's changed life, a person of the past. We know him as the Apostle Paul, but there was a time when he was more commonly referred to as Saul by his Hebrew name, Saul of Tarsus. Well, this man is an individual who had a choice. He had to make a decision as to whether he was going to invite this change into his life. Now, friends, when we thought about some of those questions, well, what type of change is it going to be? What degree or what level, how comprehensive is that change going to be? Well, how is it going to impact my life? Well, friends, as it relates to the Apostle Paul and his changed life, it was dramatic. It was all-encompassing. It was a very comprehensive change. Again, it was a change of marked difference, one that we have categorized and defined up here under the terms defiant to devoted. And please understand, as we have already considered, it was to the same cause. So here we found in Saul of Tarsus a man who was defiant. He was boldly and openly resistant toward a cause. That cause being Jesus Christ, New Testament Christianity, the Lord's church. But he then invited a change from being defiant to that cause to one being totally devoted. A term now that is just at the opposite end of the spectrum of defiant. Instead of resisting, openly opposing that cause, now he has embraced it so much that he is giving himself up to it. He is surrendering. We talked about how his devotion to Christ, Christianity, and the Lord's church has evidenced itself, manifested itself in his life as we look at what he surrendered for that cause, what he suffered for that cause. We talked about also with regards to that change concerning how it produced and required sacrifices by Paul, significant sacrifices. And then also how that it was something that was steadfast for the remainder of his life. You remember I suggested we might ask, well, how long is this change going to impact my life? And we suggested that might have some bearing as to whether we make the change. Well, in light of all of those things as it pertained to this potential change on the part of Saul of Tarsus, he made that choice. He invited that change. A change from being defiant to that cause to now being devoted, dedicated, separating himself, giving himself entirely to that cause. Now, friends, it had a dramatic impact on his life. And friends, as he was maybe evaluating that change, all of those impacts were not favorable. Now, there were some very favorable impacts to his life with regards to even his future, but the present, friends, his life dramatically changed. He had been, if you will, he had been an individual who was advantaged and enjoyed a privileged status among the Jews. But friends, in inviting this change, in choosing to make that change in his life, he exchanged all of that to invite fierce and persistent persecution into the remainder of his life. So I don't know about you, but it makes me ask the question, why would he do that? What cause can we explain that degree of change to? And so that's what I want us to now embark upon in our ongoing series. We talked about the change itself. We talked about what it meant to be defiant, what it meant to be devoted, how those two extremes manifested themselves in the life of the Apostle Paul. But now, I want to ask the question, why would the Apostle Paul have made that change? What could have produced that kind of change with that kind of magnitude? the life of Paul? Well, it certainly had a great impact on his life, that change. But friends, before we actually look at the cause that brought about this change in the life of the Apostle Paul, I want us to briefly consider the impact that this change in the life of Paul had on others. Now, obviously, in choosing to make the change, as we said, it had a very significant impact on the life of Paul personally. But I want us to appreciate how that change made by one man had a significant impact on the lives of others. First of all, let me just say in a very generic way, friends, this profound change, evident in this man, Saul of Tarsus, from defiant to devoted to the same cause, a change that occurred when he obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. Did you know, friends, that is compelling testimony to the truthfulness of New Testament Christianity? Compelling testimony. Let me see if I can illustrate that in any reasonable way. But first of all, as we just think about it, to suggest that the change that we see in this man, Saul of Tarsus, from defiant to devoted, that change has to be explained by some what? That's the question. What was the cause? What factored into that change? What would have caused Paul to make that change? How do you explain? How do you explain a man who was enjoying those advantages that we spoke of earlier because of his privileged status among the Jews? How do we explain that man choosing to make a change voluntarily, a change in which he was going to surrender all of that to then invite into his life persecution, suffering, every day, dying, if you will, for this cause that now he was going to be devoted to? How do you explain that? Well, I would submit that the only rational explanation is to accept the truthfulness of that cause for which Saul made the change. And that's what I'm suggesting, that this change in and of itself is powerful testimony to the truthfulness of New Testament Christianity. Now, let me offer some evidence for that. And this involves a little history. But in 1747, a man by the name of Lord George Littleton, please understand that first term, Lord, that's his title. And back then, in the middle 1700s, he lived in England. He lived in Britain. And here was a man who was an Oxford-educated scholar. But more than that, he was distinguished as a member of British Parliament. That's the reason for his title, Lord. Well, here is a man, and in 1747, he published a book that was entitled, quote, Observations of the Conversion of St. Paul, end of quote. In it, Mr. Littleton is going to argue for the truthfulness of the Christian system. But before we so quickly jump over all of that, we need to back up a little bit. Because the apologetic value of this publication written by Mr. Littleton is truly significant. And here's why. You see, Mr. Littleton was initially highly skeptical of Christianity. In fact, at that time, as I understand it, men of that day and that section of the world, friends, those individuals who were viewed as intellectuals, those individuals who were viewed among the social elite, such as politicians in Parliament, those individuals almost universally were not believers in God. They were infidels, maybe agnostics, but at least skeptics.
That was true of Mr. Littleton. Lord George Littleton was a skeptic. He was not a believer in Christianity as being God's religion for all men. He was not. In fact, he undertook this study with regards to Paul. He undertook this study with the intent of discrediting Christianity, because he believed that he could compellingly demonstrate that Paul's conversion, this change that this man underwent, was to be attributed to something other than how it was explained in the Scriptures. And so, please understand, that's the beginning point for Mr. Littleton. And so, after whatever period of time, careful, thorough research, Mr. Littleton was brought to just the opposite conclusion. The result of his investigation was just the opposite of what he anticipated. He came away after his research, no longer being a skeptic, no longer being a non-believer in Christianity. In fact, I want to ask you to listen to one of the affirmations that he made in that publication. Again, Observations of the Conversion of St. Paul. Listen to what he said, because he became convinced through his research that the conversion of Paul proved the case of Christianity. I want you to listen to it in his own words. Here's what he wrote, quote, "The conversion and apostleship of St. Paul alone," listen to that, "alone, duly considered, was of itself a demonstration sufficient to prove Christianity to be a divine revelation." End of quote. I hope we understood what he was saying. Friends, Mr. Littleton, in that research that he did, in which he intended to discredit Christianity, he came away saying, if all you had was the conversion of the Apostle Paul, it of itself would stand as proof of the truthfulness of New Testament Christianity. And so, friends, today, that paper, I believe I am right in saying this, Ricky, I believe that's still in print. Now, please understand, 1747, 2023, that's 275 years ago. That paper, a great treatise in defense of Christianity, based solely upon Paul's conversion. That's the only evidence he looks at. And he comes away and says, that in and of itself is sufficient to prove Christianity is the true religion. Friends, that's what I meant by the fact that this change in the life of this man, it not only impacted his life, it has impacted the lives of many others. Even today, friends, the dramatic change in the life of Saul of Tarsus stands as a perpetual monument to the truthfulness of New Testament Christianity and the life-changing power of the good news found in Jesus Christ. And for honest people like Mr. Littleton, it's compelling evidence. It's compelling evidence. And so, now, we come back to that original question. What else could have been offered as the reason that Paul would have accepted that change, invited that change into his life, that brought such negative impact as persecution and suffering, that required such surrender and sacrifice? What else could explain that? I'm not sure there's anything that could. And so now we have to turn our attention to, well, what was the cause that brought about the change for Paul? Friends, I believe the answer has to come in one word: evidence. Evidence. I think all of us are familiar with that word. Evidence speaks to a ground for belief. Evidence is something that furnishes proof in a trial, courtroom, The jury is looking for evidence, either to convict or to acquit. They're looking for grounds for proof. They're looking for things that prove and establish something as being true. And so as we think about the Apostle Paul and the change that he underwent, the change that he chose to participate in, that had such an impact on his life, so profound, what could have brought about that change? I can't think of anything other than evidence. Evidence has to be the reason for that change that we observe in the life of Saul of Tarsus. What am I suggesting? Evidence, compelling, persuasive evidence had to have been presented to this man that provided for a solid ground for a new belief. He had to see evidence, such undeniable evidence, that was presented to him that convinced this man that something was absolutely true, despite what he may have thought previously about that. Evidence. In other words, I'm suggesting the same thing that Mr. Littleton did. And that is that what Paul was presented by way of evidence brought this man to the conclusion it cannot be anything but the truth. But the truth. And so now I want us to, under this point, I want us to consider what that evidence was. Because it has to be pretty compelling. It has to be, again, undeniable for us to understand why Paul would make this change. And so I want us to ask what that evidence was, what form did it take? And friends, the answers that we're going to provide to that question will come in our reading the accounts of Saul's conversion that are recorded for us in the book of Acts. And so let me invite you over to the book of Acts. Now, friends, we actually have in the book of Acts 3 accounts of Saul's conversion. The first of those, and that's where we're going to, probably not today, but when we come back, that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time. That is the inspired narrative of what happened to Saul at this juncture of his life when this change took place. That's recorded for us in Acts chapter 9. But then later, as the Apostle Paul, we're going to find that he is going to rehearse what happened to him in that moment of change to 2 groups of people. One of those is a mob in the city of Jerusalem. That's recorded for us in Acts chapter 22, beginning in verse 1. And then a second time, Paul is going to rehearse these events before a group of dignitaries. And principal among them was a man by the name of King Agrippa. And that's going to happen in the city of Caesarea on the coast. Now, in addition to those 3 accounts that will provide us the evidence, if you will, that was so compelling as to bring Paul to this dramatic change in his life, we're also, Lord willing, going to think about some various inspired statements that Paul would later make in his inspired letters to Christians and congregations of God's people. But for the remainder of our time this morning, since it's short, I just want us to think about something as it relates to this change. And again, the fact that it gives testimony, compelling testimony, to the truthfulness of New Testament Christianity, the cause of Christ. And how that this change that impacted one man so dramatically could have the power to impact the lives of others as well. And to, again, demonstrate that from the book of Acts, I want us to quickly this morning look at the other 2 occasions that I mentioned. So we're going to save Acts chapter 9, Lord willing, for next week, to look at the narrative itself, to consider that evidence that produced this change in the life of the Apostle Paul. But I want us just to see how that over in Acts chapter 22 and again in Acts chapter 26, how that Paul himself is going to relate and rehearse this change that happened to him, to offer testimony as to the truthfulness of the cause that he has now devoted his life to. Hopefully that'll make a little more sense as we think about each of these two settings and what prompted them and what Paul was given an opportunity to do. All right, so look there in Acts chapter 22. Acts chapter 22 found the Apostle Paul in the city of Jerusalem. He was in the temple. He was there with other Jews. And when he came out, there was a mob of people. If you look there in Acts chapter 21 at the end of, Acts chapter 21, look at verse 30. Oh, I'm sorry, look at verse 27. And when the 7 days, this is chapter 21, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him, Paul, in the temple, they stirred up all the people, laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place. And further, he brought Greeks also into the temple and has polluted this holy place. Look at why they made that charge, verse 29. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. Well, friends, they shut the door of the temple, they grabbed Paul, and literally they were going to kill him right there on the spot. He's rescued. He's rescued by the Roman centurion. We come to find out later what his name is, Claudius Lysias. But I want you to understand what he does. He rescues him from this mob. He brings him up on the stairs. And he is assuming that this man, Paul, was actually, look at verse 38, Art thou not that Egyptian which before these days made an uproar and led out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? He totally misjudged who Paul was. But now Paul says, Sir, let me address the crowd. Let me address the crowd. When he heard Paul speak in Greek, he knew he wasn't that Egyptian. And so he grants Paul this opportunity. I want you to think what Paul could have done. Matter of fact, rather than try to do that, let me just read from Brother J.W. McGarvey. Please understand, Brother McGarvey was an instrumental individual in the Restoration movement. This particular preacher and writer, he lived back during the 1800s. They didn't write the same way we do, Harold. And so some of this long sentences, and we might be accustomed to this kind of wording, but it is really, I think, well stated by him. And I just want to make sure I am properly representing it. Because here's what Brother McGarvey helped me appreciate. See, Paul now was given an opportunity to make a defense. And here's what he could have defended. He said, I didn't bring a Greek into the temple, because he hadn't. He could have tried to correct their understanding or misunderstanding about his attitude toward the law. He could have saved himself imprisonment had he offered that defense. But that's not what he does. Brother McGarvey suggested that Claudius Lysias, the chief Roman officer who arrested him, he gave Paul an opportunity to speak because he was hopeful in hearing what he said, he would better understand what all this commotion is about. And you know what Paul's going to do instead of make a defense? He's going to relate his change. He's going to speak to this mob who just moments earlier were trying to kill him. He's going to relate to this mob his change and offer that as to why what he is now devoted to and promoting is true. I find that remarkable. And that's what Brother McGarvey was saying. He said after Claudius Lysias heard what Paul said on the stairs there,
because he's going to have to rescue him again. They're about ready to kill him after he mentions the word Gentile. And they're about to, again, take him into the mob and kill him. And so Lysias probably is amazed. He's thinking, I didn't learn anything there. I didn't learn anything with regards to the guilt or innocence of this man. But I want you to listen to how Brother McGarvey presents this. The speech is still a source of astonishment. Here is a man in the hands of a heathen soldiery with a prison door opening behind him, and before him a mob thirsting for his blood, whom to appease would save him from prison and perhaps from death, yet appearing to be utterly oblivious of the danger which surrounded him, and though permitted to speak, making not the slightest effort to obtain his release. He could most truthfully have denied bringing Greeks into the temple, or denied speaking improperly of the people, the law, or that holy place. But he was so far elevated above all selfish considerations that he desired no vindication of himself, not involving a vindication of the cause that he was pleading. He saw before him a deluded multitude rushing blindly to his destruction, and though they were thirsting for his own blood, he pitied them and resolved to give them light. He remembered when he once took part in a similar mob, and the blood of Stephen rose up before his vision. And the vision of Christ, glorified, which he had witnessed on the road to Damascus, had changed him from a persecutor to a disciple, and he resolved to try to effect upon them the same change. You see what Paul does? Paul uses his change in an effort to validate not his innocence, but the truthfulness of that cause now to which he is devoted. He was trying to impact others in the same way that he had been impacted by rehearsing that change. All right, very quickly, we will do this hurriedly. Now turn over to Acts chapter 26. Acts chapter 26. Friends, we're in a different city. We're in Caesarea on the coast. And now we are a different group of people. We're not before a Jewish mob. We are before noblemen. We are before dignitaries. We are before political leaders. Among them is a man by the name of King Agrippa. Please understand, friends, this was the son of Herod, who had put to death James, the apostle. This is his son. But he was a nominal Jew. He understood something about the Jewish religion. And so here is Paul imprisoned over in Caesarea, and the governor there is Festus. Festus doesn't understand this man. He doesn't understand this argument of why he was, trying to be put to death. But Paul, instead of being sent back to Jerusalem, because he knew he was there going to be killed, he chose to appeal to Caesar. And so here is Festus, and he's got to send this prisoner over to Rome to Caesar, and he doesn't know what to say about him. And so when King Agrippa comes, he says, King Agrippa, I want you to listen to a man who I have in charge here in prison, because I got to send him on to Rome. I got to send him to Caesar, and I don't even know what to say to him. I don't understand him. I don't understand what this is all about. And so Paul is given an audience before this man, King Agrippa. Now again, you can read that over in Acts chapter 26. It even begins, Then Agrippa said unto Paul, You are permitted to speak for yourself. And Paul stretched forth his hand, and he answered for himself. But you know what he didn't do? He didn't defend himself. That's what he was given opportunity to do, to defend himself, to prove himself innocent. But you know what he does do? Same thing he did over in Acts chapter 22. He rehearses the change. He rehearses the evidence that was so compelling that brought this change on him, with the hope that it might bring the same change on those that he was addressing. Now again, I'll let you read that for yourself. We'll interject some of those things in our study, Lord willing, next week when we read from the narrative, because Acts 22, Acts 26, they both provide some supplementary material for that. But while Paul is rehearsing what happened to him, Festus, the governor, seems to lose control. And if you are familiar with this, you drop down all the way to verse 24. And as he, Paul, thus spake for himself, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. I think the American Standard Version says, Paul, you are mad. You're insane. Much learning doth make you mad. What brought that outburst? Once again, listen please to Brother McGarvey. At this point in his speech, Paul was interrupted by Festus. It was a very strange speech in the ears of that dissolute heathen. It presented to him a man who from his youth had lived in strict devotion to a religion whose chief characteristic was the hope of a resurrection from the dead, who had once persecuted to death his present friends, but had been induced to change his course by a vision from heaven, and who from that moment had been enduring stripes, imprisonment, and constant exposure to death in his efforts to inspire men with his own hope of a resurrection. Such a career Festus could not reconcile with those maxims of ease or of ambition which he regarded as the highest rule of life. Moreover, he saw this strange man, when called to answer to accusations of crime, appear to forget himself and attempt to convert his judges rather than to defend himself. There was a magnanimity of soul displayed in both the past and the present of his career, which was above the comprehension of this sensuous politician, and which he could not reconcile with sound reason. He seems to have forgotten where he was and the decorum of the occasion. So deeply was he absorbed in listening to and thinking of Paul that he just stood up and yelled out in the court of law, "You are beside yourself." Friends, he could not offer an explanation other than, this man, he's irrational. He's insane. And one of the things that Brother McGarvey suggests led him to that conclusion, he just couldn't understand. Here is a man who is given an opportunity to defend his innocence, and that's not what he uses the time for. Rather, he uses the time to rehearse the evidence that brought about the change in him with the hope that it would be so compelling, so undisputable and undeniable that it would have the same impact on those that he was addressing. Now, Brother McGarvey is going to say, Festus, he rules out as even a possible candidate. He can't comprehend this. He can't understand this. But he turns to King Agrippa and he says, King Agrippa, I know you know the prophets. Is it a thing unreasonable with you to think that God can raise the dead? And do you remember how King Agrippa responded to this speech by Paul? He said, almost you persuaded me to be a Christian. Based on what? The change. The change. Friends, again, this change, oh yes, it dramatically impacted the life of this man, Saul of Tarsus. But this change, the only possible explanation as to why Paul would have accepted and invited that change into his life testifies to the truth of this cause now to which he was devoted. And Paul himself would use that change to try to convince others of it. Now, friends, again, that's not really to the point here. Lord willing, next week, next Sunday, we want to look at the evidence that convinced Paul to make this change. But I just wanted us to see how this change, friends, it is apologetically, it is a powerful testimony to the truth of New Testament Christianity, to the cause of Christ that he was so devoted to. So much so that in the mid-1700s, it could convert a skeptic to a believer simply based on that change. So much so that Paul would use it rather than take opportunity to defend his innocence. He would use it in an effort to convince them of its truthfulness so that they would invite the same change into their lives. And so I hope as we further examine the cause of this change, we will come away with the same conviction. Whatever evidence Paul must have been given, it was so compelling. It was so undeniable that it convinced him to make this change. And therefore, the same evidence should be invited or accepted by us to make the same change. Friends, that change, that evidence, it's going to certainly involve a person, and that person is Jesus Christ. And so the Apostle Paul saw Jesus on the road to Damascus in his resurrected form, in the glory from heaven. We're not going to see that. But friends, we can still see Jesus if we are willing to open the gospel records, read of his life, his teachings, so that we can see him for who he really is. That was the major evidence, the primary evidence that brought about this change in the person of Saul of Tarsus. If we can help you affect that kind of change in your life, is it going to always bring about favorable impacts? No. You'll have the forgiveness of your sins. You'll be introduced to the church of our Lord, which is the greatest spiritual family that heaven has to offer. And you will be given a life that is privileged with prayer and fellowship and worship. But you know what? It's going to bring suffering. In fact, this very man would be the one who says, all those will suffer persecution who have accepted Jesus Christ and obeyed the gospel. He knew that firsthand. But I hope that all of that negative that might come, quote, negative, that we might perceive it as, I hope that would never change you or would influence you to not accept this change of gospel obedience